Okay, so here's Samurai transfer case. This is my 489 geared one, a twin sticks. This is the transfer case I run in the rocks and like at King of Hammers. In the sand dunes, so this has a 489 gear in it. In the sand dunes and the rallycross racing, I run a stock transfer case and I run it in low basically all the time. So one of the things I've never liked about my car is my transfer case mounting. So what I'm working on here is a new setup. The mounts are strong, and I'll go underneath it in a minute and kind of show them, but I haven't had any like transfer case, issues with the mounts or breaking cases or anything like that. The issue comes is basically I swap transfer cases about once a year because I really only hit the rocks about once a year, and it's a pain to change the transfer case. It's tucked up in there and everything is so tight, and I was so focused on making sure the mounts were strong that I really didn't put enough thought into ease of serviceability. So with my mounts now, there's a plate on the side similar to this, but it's kind of upside down on this one. It swoops up on either end, and it has a urethane bushing mount here and here. And then there's basically one urethane mount here, and there's a bunch of frame structure that comes over here to support that. It grabs the original 4 bolts on this side, plus these 2 bolts. And then on this side, the 4 bolts on that pad, and then these top 3 bolts. To try to spread the load on the case. And again, like I said, I've been super happy with the strength. It's just so tight, and I have like a kind of a belly pan cradle combination thing for my link mounts and my skid plate that's solid with the frame. And so it's just really tight to get this out. So I'm going to climb under the car and show that a little better and kind of explain what I'm trying to do. But basically, I've got to take things apart like little bit by little bit, and the transfer case has to roll just right to drop through an open space, and you have to get the shifters out first. Like I said, it's just a pain. And so my goal is to make it to where with this setup, I'm hoping I'll have a bushing mount here, a bushing mount there, and there's gonna be a similar plate over here with another bushing mount and bushing mount. So, besides the drive lines and speedo cable, that regular stuff, I'll just have 4 bolts to pull and the whole thing will just drop straight down. And I'm hoping that the shifters can stay in place. I love this twin stick shifter, but there's like these 2 billet pieces that drop in here, and they're pretty tough to deal with, especially in my car because my seats are wide, and this is just really down in a hole and tough to deal with. And you can't really deal with it from underneath either. So I'm hoping with this system, these can just stay in and everything will just drop straight down. So I'll go underneath the car and show that a little better. Okay, so here I am under the car. And this was this kind of cradle thing I was talking about. It's basically 2-inch square tubing in a rectangle. And then my link mounts. This is my rear, this bolt's for my rear upper wishbone. And so it passes all the way through the frame and through a set of brackets. And same thing for my front upper link. I made this thing very symmetrical. All the lower links are the same. Tried to make that really friendly and useful, and so far it's worked out pretty well. And so here's this 2x2 framework. And then I have this center piece, which I thought would be great for the skid plate for support. And it is, but you can see the transfer case has just got this small window to drop out of. So this is going to get cut out. And it's tough to see, but this is the one piece I was talking about. And there's the bushing mount. And it's tucked way up in there, and it's hard to get tools in there. And then there's the front one. So all that's going to get cut out. And then for the upper mount, or the driver's side mount, it's got a tube and a bushing, and it grabs that, and then like I showed on the front side of the case, it wraps around and grabs some of those other bolts. But it's just so tight. And you gotta like pull this bolt out and then pull this piece off in the car so that everything can drop out. And same thing with this other side piece. It won't fit through that hole with all those pieces, and it relies on that center tube for its mounting. And then there's this other tube that comes over and shoots over to the frame rail behind the exhaust here, and that kind of hurts my exhaust clearance. So I'm going to cut all this out, and there'll basically be, like I said, a bushing here, a bushing here, a bushing here, and a bushing there. And I'll pull those 4 bolts, and the whole thing should just drop straight down once I get the drive lines off. There you can see where it grabs the other bolts. It's got a pretty thick plate, kind of a crescent shape. And then my transmission mount kind of comes off of that as well. You can see it's just tight, and so I want to eliminate having to work up in all those tight areas and make it to where it just drops out. So you can kind of see what I was talking about. That bolt goes through the frame, there's a tube, and then through this plate. So it's like a 9-inch long bolt, but these wishbones, like a wishbone style 3-link, that's where it's on the diff. A lot of force gets put on these. So that's my goal, try to get this a little more serviceable. My first year at King of the Hammers, I had a transfer case failure. And I just knew the amount of time it would have taken to swap it. The race would have been over. It's just so much work. So I want to make this a much faster turnaround. So I'm gonna go back to the computer and work on some other pieces. All right, so now back looking at this again. In that rectangle of square tubing, that centerpiece, I said I'm going to cut out. I want that support for my skid plate, because my skid plate's 3/4 inch plastic. So the other plate that's going to be on this side will have a flange on the bottom, so it'll support the skid plate and then have some attachment points. But I got this mocked up to where that's square. That's basically square in the car. And so I'm trying to figure out how to get some good measurements of where this sits in relation to that plate, and then the height and the angle and all that stuff to figure out. I'd like to make this plate in one piece to where it'll grab these 4 bolts and then be bent to head straight down. And then it'll have those notches on either end for the bushing tubes. And then once I have these 2 plates in place, and then I'm gonna take and go a vertical, like a wall between them, and try to catch some of these bottom bolts in the transfer case. And that'll just tie everything together and give the case some more support too. And then eventually, once this whole thing drops out of the car, it should only be a couple of minutes to zip all these bolts and get the case out of this kind of like subframe. But I'll probably end up building 2 of these systems for my 2 transfer cases, so I don't even have to worry about doing that, because I don't like pulling these bolts in and out. I don't want to take tension off these gaskets. Could cause a leak over time, I think. I don't know. But I think this is going to work pretty cool. Be plenty strong. I'm probably going to do like a rib all the way around this, definitely on the bottom and over the top, probably just like an inch wide, kind of make this like an I-beam in cross section. But luckily, like this whole transfer case tries to turn under torque. And so the load is basically straight up and down on this end. And this with this weird angle, I mean, it's gonna be still basically the same thing, but I gotta make sure everything's super rigid so I don't put any stresses on the case. All right, back to the drawing board. All right, so I'm sitting at the computer. This is the one plate I've already cut. And this is like a side view. So this would be, passenger side. So this is the plate that's already cut that I showed a minute ago, mounted to the transfer case. It's just flat, super simple. This is where the tubes for the bushings will be welded in. And then these two squares represent the that 2-inch square tubing kind of belly subframe thing on the bottom of my Samurai. And then this is the other side. So this is looking at it from like the end, which would be like if you're to stick your head up where the transmission is and look backwards. So this is the one flat plate. In the transfer case, the way it sits in the car, basically sits in here. And this is looking at that plate drawn out flat. So this is the mounting pad that's right here. This is a big hole for the oil fill. And these are just dimensioned out where my bins are going to be. And then the same thing, it's going to have the same bushings, front and back. So this will have 4 mounting points to the chassis. With big, they're like a leaf spring style bushing. They fit inside of an 1 3/4 120 wall tube. So it's like a 1.5 OD bushing where it goes into the tubing, with a 3/4 inch hole. I use the same bushings for almost everything. I have these on my links. The sleeve that's in my links use a 9/16 bolts. But for these, I'll probably go with a slightly heavier wall sleeve and just use 1/2-inch bolts. I haven't decided yet. The 1/2-inch bolts are so much cheaper and easier to get to, or easier to find at any kind of local hardware store. 9/16s are a little more specialized and they're not, available everywhere. But I haven't decided. Once I get this kind of farther along, I'll kind of do like a dry run if I were to be doing a transfer case swap and see what tools would be best. Because I try to keep the tools for the 9/16 bolts in the car in case I have to change a link. And so, but there's also 3/4 inch stuff in the car because there's a lot of 1/2-inch bolts like the shock eyes and stuff like that. So I haven't decided. That's something that's going to be done kind of later. Once I kind of confirm all this stuff is going to work, I've got to draw up the tabs that are going to go in place and be welded to the frame. But I kind of like how this is working out. So this top piece, I kind of chamfered off that because there's really nothing going on. But looking at it from the end, there'll be a bracket because it's going to catch two bolts of the transfer case up here. And then I'm going to end up drawing, so this kind of area here is going to be filled in with the plate with those 2 holes. And then on the outside, I'm going to do a couple ribs that'll go all the way down to the bottom. Actually, it might just be 1 rib because this oil fill hole's in the way. But I'll have a rib that'll go all the way down, and there's going to be like a flange on the bottom. So those 2 will meet and try to make this thing really stiff. And then I think I talked about it looking at the transfer case. In between these, I'm going to make a plate that ties them together and then try to catch a couple bolts of the transfer case down there too. The whole idea is to try to grab a bunch of the bolts on the case halves so that this steel kind of bridges and helps to add stiffness to the case of the transfer case, because they're just thin aluminum and I imagine there's quite a bit of deflection under hard loads. So I was trying to find like a spine rib to put it all the way around that I could just buy on eBay or something, but I've had a hard time finding one. So anyway, I'm gonna go get this cut and see how it looks. All right, so here's the second plate cut out. Cut turned out pretty nice. I did these holes as slots because I want, as this sits, you know, this has got to be straight in the car, not crooked. And I want these two pivots to be, you know, perfectly square or whatever to the center line of the transfer case. And I did the best I could to measure, you know, from the, I used basically the edge of the sheet as like my zero mark. I lined this up, and then I did my best to measure how far back this whole pad is, this mounting pad, but you know, it's kind of a tough thing to measure. So I feel like I got it really, really close, but just, so what I did is I placed the hole and then basically did a half a hole oblong in either direction. So I got a little bit of wiggle room, and you know, I'm going to leave it like that. And then when this is after this piece gets bent, the piece that grabs these, actually it's these three holes, there'll be a flange that catches these three holes, and so that'll hold the transfer case in position. So it won't want to slip in those holes, but that will give it, you know, freedom in case between my two transfer cases, if there's minor differences or whatever. This one I want to leave as just regular round holes, because this is going to be like, I know this position's right. So I want this to be like my, you know, like my index mark or whatever, my known position. And then this will float to be straight. And then when I weld this flange on, you know, that's going to set its position. So I've got to get this piece bent. It's got two bends because it tucks in pretty tight, and then it bends and then it goes straight up again. So I need to get that bent, get this bolted on, double check that everything worked out right with the hole placement and everything. And then I've got to figure out this plate that catches those holes. And then there's another little plate that catches these two holes. And depending on how well I'm able to kind of map out this bolt pattern, I might make this plate continue and go all the way over and tie into this. That's kind of my goal, is to have like this kind of under truss deal to catch more of these bolt holes. I don't know if I'll grab every single one, but at least a couple of them, and that will really, you know, stiffen all of this up. Because the big problem that these have, I mean, there's kind of two issues. These kind of motor mount style mounts, the rubber's just bonded to those plates, and over time they'll tear off. But the second and kind of worst issue, in my opinion, is the way this mount is cantilevered way out the side. You know, there's a reaction torque every time you're on the gas, especially with crawler gears. This transfer case wants to roll away. It's kind of like an axle wrap type situation, but it's, you know, every gearbox and your engine, everything has these reaction torques. And so having the mount cantilevered way out the side like that puts a lot of stress on the case right here, where it's trying to rip this little pad loose. And I've seen if these bolts get loose, it can tear the threads out. But even a worse case, I think, is just this leverage puts deflection in the case. And you know, you get a little bit of a deflection and you alter that mesh between gears, and your strength goes downhill very fast. So that's why I want to bridge all this together, so that there's no torque being put on that mounting pad anymore. It'll just be a straight, you know, this plate's going to go straight down. So this is just going to hold it. It's not going to be trying to twist it. there's similar issues with side kicks and their front differentials. I don't know what's going on with Suzuki and their weird mounts, but it's kind of a common theme, unfortunately, but they're easy to fix. You can see I did put a big like access window for the drain plug or the fill plug. So I think it turned out pretty nice. So I'm gonna get this bin up and see how it looks. Okay, so here's the plate bin up. I got the bolts in. I got a couple small revisions I need to make. You can kind of get an idea of what this looks like. I'm not sure if I'm gonna keep this pointing straight up or tip it in to match this closer. But what the idea is now is I'm gonna make a plate that captures these 3 bolts, and it's gonna sit against this surface and basically come out and be like a strengthening rib that goes all the way to the bottom. And so it's gonna, from basically, depending on clearance, but basically from this bend point here, it's gonna start going on the other side of this. Grab that bolt, that bolt, and then come out, probably come outboard of this surface about a 1/2 inch, then kind of taper wider to about a 1.5 inch radius from this corner, and then go straight down to the bottom. So it'll be a gusset for the 2 bends, and then kind of tie the whole, stiffen the whole vertical surface of that plate from being able to move this way. But I'm liking how it's turned out. We gotta do a couple tweaks. This line I was off. It needs to come forward a little bit because it needs to be basically flush. You can see I'm about 1/8 of an inch off because I want this edge to be flush with where those bolts seat on the case, so that when that other plate is there, it's tight here and it hits this at the same time. Looks like I was pretty darn close on the holes, almost centered perfectly. I need to adjust the angle of this bend a little bit because I was shooting for that to be square. And you can see it's off like 1 degree. So I think if this bend is perpendicular or parallel, depending on how you look at it, to the angle of the transfer case. But this mounting pad, I don't know, it's kind of some weird compound angles, so it's hard to measure. Sometimes you just got to build something and see how it turns out, and then it gives you something to shoot for in the next go around. So I also want to probably cut some slits because it distorted these bottom holes. Even with my super narrow bottom tooling, it distorted these bottom holes being so close to the bend. So I might do a little relief cut. Yeah, so I'm gonna go back to the computer, make those adjustments, and cut out another one. And then once I get that dialed and I get this spread, I'm shooting for 9 3/4 in here on the inside. Then I'll start building this bottom piece. I'll probably build the bottom piece first, and then I'll tackle this top one, just to try to get this solid and not to where it doesn't move. But hopefully you can tell now what this looks like. So it's gonna have 4 like leaf spring or shackle bushing assemblies on each corner, and the whole thing will just slide up into the bottom, and there'll be tabs off of that my little lower subframe. So it should be really easy to remove. Once you pull the 3 drive lines loose. I still run a speedometer, so it'll have a speedo cable you have to pull. Eventually I'm gonna get rid of that. I'm gonna go to a different dash, but honestly, I put some effort into keeping my speedo when I built this thing, and I don't know that I've ever looked at it. Doesn't really matter. So it'd be nice to get rid of the speedo cable for just, make like a, I'm not 100% sure if oil will come out if you don't put a cable in there, but if it does, I'll make like a little billet plug cap and then kind of glue it in there and be one less place to leak. So overall, I'm liking it. I think it's going to be super strong, maybe even stronger than the system I have now. And a huge amount easier to work with. So, like I said, gonna go back to the computer, make these adjustments, and try another one. Okay, I've made my changes. So with my terrible hand gestures, this is what that rib will look like. Except I've still got to figure out how to basically do this area where those 3 bolts are going to be. So it'll extend from here up and catch those 3 bolts and then come over. But this is the exterior profile that I'm looking at. I adjusted this bend angle, and then I made these little slits here. So that'll let this material right here bend freely without distorting the edge of the hole. And then once it's done, I will probably weld these back up, just because I don't want to cause a weak point. And then something I do a lot of, I put these tiny little semi-circular little notches, and that's where all my bends are located. That way I don't have to. I can just take a straight edge and hit it with a Sharpie, and then it's pretty easy to line that up in the press brake. Because the first one I had these dimensions figured out, and then I set the back stops, and honestly that's kind of more of a pain than it's worth for onesie twosie parts. So a lot of times I'll try to just kind of build it into the part so I don't even have to know what the measurements are, unless it's something that's really critical for the dimensions. But this really isn't. I could be off, I could be off of the line 20, 30, 40 thousandths and not be a big deal. I tried sticking a socket on that filler plug, so I ended up lowering. It worked, but it was tight, so I dropped the bottom of this another 3/4 of an inch. And so now I am ready to make the second one. Yeah, but once I get this done, I'm still trying to figure out how to do accurate measurements from basically this ground level up to the bolts on the bottom of the case, to make this bulkhead that's going to be in here. And I want to catch 3 bolts. Trying to figure out how to accurately measure that stuff out. It's kind of a pain, but maybe once I get this plate on, I don't know, I'll figure it out. Maybe I could tip it up and then put a straight edge across. I do have a center finding caliper that works pretty well, but it's big, and a lot of the times the part itself kind of gets in the way. So that's the part I'm struggling with, but I'll get it figured out, and it'll be probably a similar thing where I'll cut 1 or 2 of them before I get it right. But the good thing is, once it's right, it's saved in the computer, and it's easily reproduced. So I'm gonna get this tool pathed and cut it out again and see how it goes. All right, so here's the second set of plates. Cut out, cleaned up, kind of mocked up in place. Got the bends, and it's looking pretty good. From before, so the mount in my car now grabs this bolt, and this bolt. No, I take that back. It grabs these 3. I may abandon grabbing this one. I might just grab these 2. I just don't really see it being that necessary, but we'll see. So anyway, this new plate is going to grab these 2 bolts, and then from after this it's gonna just kind of fade down to that bend on the inside. And then out here, kind of how that gusset rib is on my drawing on the computer. It'll extend out, come down, and then head straight down to the bottom. And then on the inside of this plate, directly opposite of that will be the plate that comes in, and it's gonna grab some of these bolts down here. I'm probably just gonna grab the bottom two. Maybe that one. I hate to go, I mean, ideally I would surround this whole thing in steel, but you know, I'm trying to thread the needle between weight and strength and simplicity. I don't think grabbing so many bolts really, unless you're surrounding this with a spine that goes all the way around, I don't think you're really doing a lot to strengthen the case. And a big reason you have to strengthen the case is basically this original mounting horn, the way it extends way out, that puts a ton of leverage on the case and distorts it. The way this cradle it works, you know, that moment, that leverage is gone. So I don't think I really need to grab all the bolts, and this system is going to be more stiff than my system I have in my car currently, which already gets rid of that big leverage because it puts the bushing right here. But this should be even more rigid. So I think I'm going to be good by only grabbing 2 of these bolts. Something on kicking around. I'm going to turn the camera off for a second so I can spin this around. So I got to do some digging. I don't know if these holes are threaded. They're all full of dirt and stuff right now. But something I've thought about is just making a simple piece that just loops around, grabs this, and then loops around this and grabs these 4 bolts, and would be, you know, basically a strengthening girdle for the case on the backside. And then, you know, that's a real simple, basic piece to make. It'd just be a flat plate. It'll have 2 bends and help, you know, any distortion between these shafts. And I don't know that that's necessary. You know, I'm not going to do it right now, but it's just something I've thought about. What I need to do, I have a case, my first transfer case I was in my car when I raced it actually broke. Not the case itself, but the gears. I've talked about it in the past, but my first King of the Hammers race in my Samurai, you know, I spent a whole year building it. I went to a race to watch and had it ready for the next year, and it was down to the wire. I literally, you know, I kind of joke, my test drive was pulling it out of the garage and putting it in the trailer to head down, and we were like 10 hours late leaving from when we wanted to. So, you know, I had problems. I had the stock axle gears, which are 373s, and then I had a 6.4 Sumo gears in my T-case. And I had also switched to a different header on my engine, and it hurt the bottom end power pretty badly. And so it didn't have the power to go through the desert in high range. It just bogged and really struggled. And so we ended up ripping pretty hard for a couple miles in low range, just, you know, 6,000 RPMs, 5th gear, low range. And I imagine the transfer case was super hot. And the teeth on the input shaft came loose on the first big climb that we had to do. So that being said, I need to look at that case. I don't remember where that gear is in the length here. I'm not sure where, you know, what side of the case would benefit from more stiffness. Is basically what I'm in a roundabout way trying to get to. But, you know, I don't use that low gear anymore. Now I run 489s and 513 axle gears, so there's a lot less stress on the transfer case. So I'm pretty happy knowing that this system is going to be better than what I currently run, and what I currently run's been working awesome. So really, the main thing about all this is just getting this out of the car easier. Because like I said before, I swap between, this is my 489 geared transfer case with the twin sticks. This is what I run in the rocks and at King of the Hammers. And in the sand dunes and rallycross racing, I run a stock transfer case. And I basically run that one in low range virtually all the time. The gearing works really well in the dunes and the little tight, twisty courses of the rallycross tracks. So I want this to be a very quick and easy swap out. And I also am working on building a kind of a universal cradle 4-link setup for a couple other samurais I'm going to be working on. And the way my cradle setup works, you have to eliminate all the original transfer case mounts off of the frame because they're in the way. And so this would be part of the cradle, this, better mounting system. So that's the whole point of this. I'm going to be converting my Samurai over to this system and then using that to fine tune the details for the new ones I'm going to build. So the next thing, I got to get this goes across the bottom. So I'm going to get this tacked in place. I got to double check some of these angles, make sure everything's perfect. And then I'm going to get this welded on the bottom. And then I can start figuring out this bottom and side rib piece. And then that'll be it for the pieces for this, other than I got to cut some DOM tubing that'll sit in those semicircular parts there and have some urethane bushings in them. So I'm going to get going on that kind of H looking piece. All right, so I got it tacked up. Got just 3 tacks on each side, but I got everything, these kind of coped semicircles here are square across. So now this is the basic shape of how it's going to be. So now I got to figure out how to accurately measure, where these holes are in relation to this corner. And so basically all I have available to grab is this bolt, and that bolt. The next one up is not in the same plane as those. And so, this plate will start kind of up here, go straight out, grab that, then kind of scallop and swoop around, grab that third bolt, and then it'll probably just angle uphill a little ways to tie into this corner. I haven't decided yet. I'll probably basically hit that bolt and then come out and then basically follow the angle of the case up to about this point here, I'd say. And then that other rib will, they're going to be in alignment with each other fore and aft. So it'll make a really strong piece there, because the face of that case is basically all in the same plane, and so that surface will continue all the way under and across, and then it's sitting in this U, so it should be really stiff. And if this was going in a car that wasn't fully caged, I wouldn't do 4 mounting points. I would only do 3. The reason Suzuki did the 3 mounting points, it's actually 2 on this side and 1 on this side, is so that the car's frame could flex. If you ever have like a leaf sprung Samurai all articulated out, you go to open and close the doors, you notice they kind of drag because everything flexes. And so mounting things on 3 points isolates the gearboxes from the flex. But with mine and the other ones I'm going to be building, they're fully, the chassis is fully rigid, all caged and triangulated. And so for overall like beef and strength, And honestly, simplicity for this design, 4 points was easier to work with. Just because the way this is mounting into the belly pan. 3 points wouldn't have been as simple to do. And plus too, these bushings are real close together, side to side. And so flex, any minor flex that were to still happen is going to be less exaggerated because of that. Really, this is just off of the center line of the vehicle, this one. And then this one's just over, pretty close to where the original was. So it's pretty narrow. And I did that for mine because my exhaust clearance through here is pretty awful right now. And so cutting out all my old stuff and having this kind of nice tunnel, it's going to give a nice space for larger exhaust. I'm kind of stuck. I built my exhaust all 2-inch, and it's still 2-inch with the turbo. And I kind of wish I'd done this project first, because that would have opened up space to go to 2.5 or 2 1/4 or something. I'm a little nervous 2-inch might be a bottleneck, but we'll see. But at least now, once this is done, I'll have the option to switch it later. So I think this is pretty cool. Kind of got some fancy holes to make, shave a little bit of weight and make it look cool. And then this side, I put a huge hole in it, so you got plenty of room to get a socket onto the fill plug, and plus you can still get your fingers through that hole to get the plug in, as well as there's access from around the back. Around that way you could get your hand in there too. I think it's gonna turn out pretty good. So the next thing I gotta do is figure out these other plates, and that's gonna take some hours on the computer and fiddly measurements, so. I try not to ever show that kind of boring stuff, but if there's something important that I find, I'll share. So when I come back, we'll be with those plates. All right, so I'm kind of goofing around with these new flanges for the bottom and the side and this big gusset. So it looks like I can really only grab 2 bolts. There's another bolt basically in this corner here, but it's not on the same plane as these two. So to be able to use that bolt, then I'll have to come up with some kind of precise little spacers to go under these 2 tabs, because this one is higher, basically closer to us looking at the screen. So I think I'm just gonna delete that one and just use these 2 on the same plane. And I've got this one figured out. Those are the 2 bolts I talked about. And then this whole kind of wing is gonna sit on top of what's already there. I'll be able to explain that better once it's cut. All right, so I got a couple of these plates cut. This is this one. And I got to do some cleanup and grinding. It's still really hot, but that'll end up welding all the way down, and then all the way down here. And then this one, I got to do a little trimming. It's a little too tight to fit in all the way that way. You can see it'll grab those 2 bolts. And I ended up figuring out I could extend it all the way up to the top, so that way it'll weld all the way the full distance. I might have to cut this eyelid off. It looks like this bolt might be slightly, the top of the surface that the bolt pushes against it might be proud of this surface. So we'll see. Once I get it cleaned up, it's a little hard to tell. It still has all of the slag on the back from the cut. I just wanted to see what it looked like. Did some little fancy triangular rounded out holes. But I think this is gonna be pretty bulletproof. So once I get those cleaned up and fit and tacked in place, the next thing is I gotta cut some, it's gonna be 1 3/4 DOM tubing, 2.5 inches long, and the 4 corners. And then the last thing will be cutting the tabs that weld to my center cradle, and we'll grab either side of those urethane bushings. I don't know, I think it turned out pretty good. Usually what I do, sometimes, you don't know how to build something until you build it wrong the first time. And so I try not to get too hung up on being absolutely perfect on the first attempt. So I kind of gave this a little extra material that way. That's why it's tight. So usually what I'll do, if I can, I'll fudge being too big, and then I'll grind it to fit. And then I'll try to take note of how much material I took off, and then update the drawing so that if I go to build a new piece, those corrections have been made on the computer. Basically this plate and this plate I made twice, basically for that reason. It was kind of hard to tell exactly what to do. And so sometimes you just got to make a plate or make a part and then do the measurements and adjustments based off of the part, once it's in place, because it's easier to tell once you have something in your hand than just a bunch of measurements. So, but I'm pretty stoked. I think this is going to be a nice addition. Should be super strong. And like I said before, the whole idea of all of this is just easier service. I don't know, people that watch my videos, Shannon Campbell, who's kind of like a god in the off-road world. He's won King of Hammers a bunch of times. He recently started making videos, and I've been watching him a lot. And he's really big on serviceability of the stuff he makes, and I've been learning quite a bit just watching his videos, so I'm trying to apply those little lessons to this project. So that's where we're at right now. I'm gonna get these parts cleaned up and fit, and then basically I'll get these pieces bolted into the transfer case, snug up the bolts to where they're in place, and then I'll tack weld, basically using the transfer case as a fixture. And then I'll get these pieces tacked in place, and then I'll pull the transfer case out and fully weld everything. And then the next step is pulling my car in and cutting out all of the old brackets to get this fit in place. Something I did when I built all of the mounts that I'm currently replacing, so when the car was still mostly original, all the original mounts had to be cut out to facilitate mounting my belly pan. And so what I did is I made parts that bolted to the flanges, and it would go out to the frame and tack weld in place on all three of these flanges. So I basically bolted just a piece of material, tack welded it to the frame, same thing on the back, same thing over there. And then I could cut out all the original mounts and knew that this was staying exactly in place. So, then I built all my new mountings. And so I'm gonna do that again with this. I'll build those little plates, tack weld wherever I can, and then cut out all those mounts, and then then install all of this. And that'll keep my transfer case perfectly mounted. And then all I have to do is weld the tabs here and here on these four corners. And then once those are set, take those those temporary mounts out, and nothing moves. So that's the way I like to do it. I try to do as little measuring and, especially on stuff like this with weird angles, because this whole thing, as you can see, is not level in the car, it's tipped back. So instead of trying to, get this thing mounted in space somehow, it's easier just to make temporary mounts that I can cut off later. Anyway, I'm gonna get these parts cleaned up and fit, and I'll come back when everything's kind of tacked up in place. So you can get a real good idea what this looks like. You see, I was talking about earlier this oil filler hole, tons of room. So, all right, I'm gonna get to work. All right, so like I said, sometimes you can't build stuff until you build it wrong the first time. So this hole is a little off, but it's a little more than 1/16 of an inch too low. This one's also too low and a little off to the side. So like I said, sometimes if you just get it built the best you can, and then you stick it in place, and then you can tell the difference of where you're off. I also need to clearance around this a little more. So I'm gonna take notes, go back to the computer, and build another piece. It's kind of the nice thing about having a plasma table, is all this stuff is in the computer and pretty easily edited and fixed when there's issues. I might also adjust. I was kind of worried about clearing this little nub here, and I gave myself a little too much room. I'd like for this line to be a little higher to back up this rib a little more. So I'm also going to add about 1/4 inch to that line. So get on the computer and make those adjustments and make a new piece. But this is basically the overall of what it's going to look like besides the bushing tubes. So you can see I try to grab the case on 2 dimensions on each side. So you got this plane and this plane with those 2 bolts, and the same thing over here, this plane and then this plane. I just feel like, you know, when you grab things in 2 dimensions like that, it can't go anywhere. With this, it's solid against that surface, but if those bolts were loose, it could slide on that surface. But when you have this plane attached, you know, it's just totally locked in. All right, go get back to work on the CAD side and get this fixed. Okay, so I think I already showed this, but I built this first plate here, and that hole is off, and I want to add more material there. So I redrew the part. So here's the new part right off the table. Also this corner right here is kind of touching the transfer case right next to that bolt. So I open that up a little bit. Pretty happy with the cut quality we got going here today. Get this to focus up close. 3/16 kind of seems to be the sweet spot for this machine, where it's almost laser quality. Pretty square cut. And you got the speed just right. Pretty minimal dross. Yeah, liking it. So I'm gonna get this cleaned up, and luckily that piece isn't welded in yet, it's just held in by the 1 bolt. So I'm gonna get that piece off and this one clean and put it and see how my adjustments worked out. Like I said before, a lot of times I just I do the best I can with the measuring and try not to like drive myself insane and just cut apart and see how it fits. You know, it's often much easier to edit a part, you know, just basically do like a rough draft part to see where you're right and where you're wrong, and then it's pretty easy to correct from there. Especially something like this transfer case. Like, this is hard to measure. There's really zero straight or square edges to go off of. I think I must have just wrote something down wrong, because I mean, really, the locations, these holes, I based everything off of this corner, so I'm not sure how I messed that up so bad, but You know, I was like bending a tape measure to try to get it in there. So who knows? But again, I don't stress it. Do the best I can and adjust from there. All right, I'm gonna get this piece cleaned up. Okay, I got that plate cleaned up and bolted in place. So you can see that spot, I've got clearance around that boss. And it's kind of hard to explain or see. You can kind of see from that angle, that boss sticks up farther than the two I'm using. So that's why I had to end up skipping that bolt. These two bosses are on the same plane. I guess if I wanted to, it looks like the boss now is basically even with the top of this. I could make another tab that would weld on top of this, but I don't really think that's necessary. You can see the heat marks. I had to grind that a little bit. I left this piece a little long because I wasn't exactly, I had to grind the first one and I didn't really keep good track of how much I took off. So I just made it the same width as the first time. Might whittle that down in the drawing a touch, but pretty happy with the fit up now. So now I'm gonna get it tacked in place. And I'm gonna do a little bit of welding with the transfer case mounted to help keep this all stiff and from distorting. See, I got a little bit of I need to adjust this part as well. It's touching at the bottom. It has about a 1/16 gap at the top. That's good enough for this part. This is for my own car. So I'm okay with it not being 100% perfect, but I will correct the drawing so that any future ones I make will be right on the money. So now the next thing I got to do, I've got to dig through my stuff. I'm not sure if I have any DOM tubing enough to make these bushing tubes, but that'll be one of the next things to do. I'm going to do some welding first because they're going to be kind of in the way. So like I said, I probably want to get this new plate welded almost 100% with the transfer case in its place. And same thing everywhere around where there's a mounting bolt. I really want to make sure to weld it with the T-case there to keep this from distorting. And then when I go to put this in for real, I'm going to pull these bolts out and replace them with long studs. Anywhere that is a mounting bolt, that includes these 4 and those 2 and the 4 down there. I have my other engine sitting here. They're all tight, but I use these long set screw style studs that has a hex on the end. And that way you can run it all the way in to make sure you're grabbing 100% of the threads. Because sometimes when you pull these bolts out, you'll see that they're only using, like 3/8 of an inch or something of the threads, and they're often threaded like twice that far. So that way the stuff that's under a high load, I want to use all the threads to get a solid grip on the aluminum as possible. So I'll use studs, that way you can thread them in by hand all the way till the bottom, and then it's usually good to back them off like a half a turn, and then hold it with an Allen key and spin your nuts down. And then for the final assembly, I use flanged nylocks. So they have like the washer built in. And I've had really good luck with those staying tight. And unfortunately, I can't Loctite the studs in place because the studs got to come out to be able to get the T-case out of this cradle. I assume these ones could, but it just seems silly to Loctite them in there because they could be in the way, if the transfer case has to come apart or something. So I usually don't Loctite them in. So that's about it. I'm probably going to wrap this video up on this T-case mount at this point because, this is kind of a filler project on my car. I'm waiting on a couple pieces to finish the turbo. So this gave me something to This gave me something to do in the meantime. It's not really a priority. But before I can really finish this, I've got to get all the old crap cut out of the bottom of my car to make room for this guy to go in. And so I'll probably pick up the next part of this build when I get to that point. And I'll have the car in on jack stands, and I'll be able to kind of get in better and show what I'm replacing and why. And get this done. I don't think I really could show before, but there's the drain plug. So I've got plenty of space for that still. And then this whole area on my car, when I play in the rocks, the whole belly pan is covered in 3/4 inch thick HDPE, high density polyethylene. So that's my skid plate. It's super tough and kind of slippery on the rocks. And then, so all of this is totally filled in with that plastic, and that stuff's really tough. And you can see the T-case is still, it's about, the lowest point is about a 1/2 inch above this surface. So I've got plenty of space. And it's basically gonna sit like this material is, right tight against the plastic. And I'll probably put a couple mounting bolts through this flanged. It gets anchored around the perimeter of my belly structure, but I'll probably put a couple bolts into this too, just to keep it tight. Yeah, so that's it for now, I guess. At some point, I may build a similar system for stock Sammys. Because honestly, the stock mounting system is terrible, and there's a couple good cradles on the market, but most of them still rely on the factory mounting points on the frame, and they fail eventually too. But mostly this is built to work with my cradle and my, I've got a 3-link, 4-link system I've been slowly working on. I want to build a kit at some point. So this will work with that. So anyway, I'm gonna stop rambling. Thanks for watching, and if this is something you like, keep your eyes open. I'll follow this up when I get it mounted in the car. Thanks again.